besties. I'm just going to plug in my phone so that it gets charged. And I'll pour a nice cup of tea. It's got my old tea bag in there and it's got a new one as well. So it will be a lovely breakfast for me. Cheers. So today I'm continuing on with Wuthering Heights. If you haven't been here for it, we're up to this part 2 of the book, because there's part 1 and part 2. And so in part 2, we're up to chapter 9. And this book is by E.Bronte. The rainy night had ushered in a misty morning, half frost, half drizzle, and temporary brooks crossed our path. Gurgling from the uplands, my feet were thoroughly wetted. I was cross and low, exactly the humour suited for making the most of these disagreeable things. We entered the farmhouse by the kitchen way to ascertain whether Mr. Heathcliff was really absent, because I put slight faith in his own affirmation. Joseph seemed sitting in a sort of Elysium, alone, beside a roaring fire, a quart of ale on the table near him, bristling with large pieces of toasted oat cake, and his black short pipe in his mouth. Catherine ran to the hearth to warm herself. I asked if the master were in. My question remained so long unanswered that I thought the old man had grown deaf, and repeated it louder. "Nay," he snarled, or rather screamed through his nose. "Nay, ye may go back where ye come from." "Joseph," cried a peevish voice, simultaneously with me, from the inner room. "How often am I to call you? There are only a few red ashes now. Joseph, come this moment." Vigorous puffs and a resolute stare in the grate declared he had no ear for this appeal. The housekeeper and Hareton were invisible, one gone and one on an errand. One gone on an errand and the other at his work probably. We knew Linton's tones and entered. "Oh, I hope he will die in a garret, starved to death," said the boy, mistaking our approach for that of his negligent attendant. He stopped. On observing his error, his cousin flew to him. "Is that you, Miss Linton?" he said, raising his head from the arm of the great chair in which he reclined. "No, don't kiss me. It takes my breath. Dear me. Papa said you would call," continued he, after recovering a little from Catherine's embrace, while she stood by looking very contrite. "Will you shut the door, if you please? You left it open, and those detestable creatures won't bring coals to the fire. It's so cold." I stirred up the cinders and fetched a scuttle full myself. The invalid complained of being covered with ashes, but he had a tiresome cough and looked feverish and ill, so I did not rebuke his temper. "Well, Linton," murmured Catherine, when his corrugated brow relaxed, "are you glad to see me? Can I do you any good?" "Why don't you come before?" he said. "You should have come instead of writing. It tired me dreadfully writing those long letters. I'd far rather have talked to you. Now I can neither bear to talk nor anything else. I wonder where Zillah is. Will you, looking at me, stepping into the kitchen and see?" I had received no thanks for my other service, and being unwilling to run to and fro at his behest, I replied, "Nobody's out there but Joseph." "I want to drink," he exclaimed fretfully, turning away. "Zillah is constantly grading off to Gimmerton since Papa went. It's miserable, and I'm obliged to come down here. They resolve never to hear me upstairs." "Is your father attentive to you, Master Heathcliff?" I asked, perceiving Catherine to be checked in her friendly advances. "Attentive? He makes them a little more attentive." "At least," he cried, "the wretches. Do you know, Miss Linton, that brute Hareton laughs at me. I hate him. Indeed, I hate them all. They are odious beings." Cathy began searching for some water. She lighted on a pitcher in the dresser, filled a tumbler, and brought it. He bid her add a spoon of wine from a bottle on the table, and having swallowed a small portion, appeared more tranquil, and said she was very kind. "And are you glad to see me?" asked she, reiterating a former question, and pleased to detect the faint dawn of a smile. "Yes, I am. It's something new to hear a voice like yours," he replied, "but I have been vexed because you wouldn't come, and Papa swore it was owing to me. He called me pitiful, shuffling, worthless thing, and said you despised me, and if he had been in my place he would be more the master of the Grange than your father by this time. But you don't despise me, do you, miss?" "I wish you would say Catherine or Cathy," interrupted my young lady. "Despise you? No, next to Papa and Ellen. I love you better than anybody living. I don't love Mr. Heathcliff, though, and I dare not come when he returns. Will he stay away many days?" "Not many," answered Linton, "but he goes on to the moors frequently since the shooting season commenced, and you might spend an hour or two with me in his absence." "Do say you will. I think I will not be peevish with you. You'd not provoke me, and you'd always be ready to help me, wouldn't you?" "Yes," said Catherine, stroking his long, soft hair. "If I could only get Papa's consent, I'd spend half my time with you. Pretty Linton, I wish you were my brother." "And then you would like me as well as your father?" observed he more tearfully. "But Papa says you would love me better than him and all the world if you were my wife, so I'd rather you were that." "No, I should never love anybody better than Papa," she returned gravely. "And people hate their wives sometimes, but not their sisters and brothers. And if you were the latter, you would live with us, and Papa would be as fond of you as he is of me." Linton denied that people ever hated their wives, but Cathy affirmed they did, and in her wisdom instanced his own father's aversion to her aunt. I endeavoured to stop her thoughtless tongue. I couldn't succeed, till everything was out. Master Heathcliff was much irritated, asserted her relation was false. "Papa told me, and Papa does not tell falsehoods," she answered pertly. "My Papa scorns you," cried Linton. "He calls him a sneaking fool." "Yours is a wicked man," retorted Catherine, "and you're very naughty to dare to repeat what he says. He must be wicked to have made Aunt Isabella leave him as she did." "She didn't leave him," said the boy. "You shan't contradict me." "She did," cried my young lady. "Well, I'll tell you something," said Linton. "Your mother hated your father. Now then." "Oh," exclaimed Catherine, too enraged to continue. "And she loved mine," added he. "You little liar! I hate you now," she panted, and her face grew red with passion. She did," sang Linton, sinking into the recess of his chair, and leaning back his head to enjoy the agitation of the other disputant, who stood behind. "Hush, Master Heathcliff," I said. "That's your father's tale too, I suppose." "It isn't. You hold your tongue," he answered. She did, Catherine. She did. Cathy, beside herself, gave the chair a violent push and caused him to fall against one arm. He was immediately seized by a suffocating cough that soon ended his triumph. It lasted so long that it frightened even me. As to his cousin, she wept with all her might aghast at the mischief she had done, though she said nothing. I held him till the fit exhausted itself. Then he thrust me away and leant his head down silently. Catherine quelled her lamentations also, took a seat opposite, and looked solemnly into the fire. "How do you feel now, Master Heathcliff?" I inquired, after waiting 10 minutes. "I wish she felt as I do," he replied, "spiteful, cruel thing. Hareton never touches me. He never struck me in his life, and I was better today and there." His voice died in a whimper. "I didn't strike you," muttered Cathy, chewing her lip to prevent another burst of emotion. He sighed and moaned like one under great suffering, and kept it up for a quarter of an hour on purpose to distress his cousin, apparently, for whenever he caught a stifled sob from her, he put renewed pain and pathos into the inflections of his voice. "I'm sorry I hurt you, Linton," she said at length, racked beyond endurance, "but I couldn't have been hurt by that little push, and I had no idea that you could either. You're not much, are you, Linton? Don't let me go home thinking I've done you harm. Answer, speak to me." I can't speak to you, he murmured. You've hurt me so that I shall lie awake all night choking with this cough. If you had it, you'd know what it was, but you'll be comfortably asleep when I'm in agony. And nobody near me. I wonder how you would like to pass those fearful nights. And he began to wail aloud for very pity of himself. Since you're in the habit of passing dreadful nights, I said, it won't be Miss who spoils your ease. You'll be the same, had she never come. However, she shall not disturb you again, and perhaps you'll get quieter when we leave you. Must I go? Asked Catherine dolefully, bending over him. Do you want me to go, Linton? You can't alter what you've done, he replied pettishly, shrinking from her, unless you alter it for the worse by teasing me into a fever. Well, then I must go, she repeated. Let me alone at least, said he. I can't bear your talking. She lingered and resisted my persuasion to departure, a tiresome while. But as he neither looked up nor spoke, she finally made a movement to the door, and I followed. We were recalled by a scream. Linton had slid from his seat onto the hearthstone and lay writhing in the mere perverseness of an indulged plague of a child, determined to be as grievous and harassing as it can be. I thoroughly gauged his disposition from his behaviour, and saw at once it would be folly to attempt humouring him. Not so my companion. She ran back in terror, knelt down and cried, and soothed and entreated till he grew quiet from lack of breath, by no means from compunction at distressing her. I shall lift him on to the settle, I said, and he may roll about as he pleases. We can't stop to watch him. I hope you are satisfied, Miss Cathy, that you are not the person to benefit him, and that his condition of health is not occasioned by attachment to you. Now then, there he is. Come away, and as soon as he knows there is nobody to care for his nonsense, he'll be glad to lie still. She placed a cushion under his head and offered him some water. He rejected the latter and tossed uneasily on the former, as if it were a stone or a black block of wood. He tried to put it more comfortably. I can't do with that, he said. It's not high enough. Catherine brought another to lay over it. That's too high, murmured the provoking thing. How must I arrange it then? She asked despairingly. He twined himself up to her as she half knelt by the settle and converted her shoulder into a support. No, that won't do, I said. You'll be content with the cushion, Master Heathcliff. Miss has wasted too much time on you already. We cannot remain 5 minutes longer. Yes, we can, replied Cathy. He's good and patient now. He's beginning to think I shall have far greater misery than he will tonight, if I believe he is the worse for my visit, and then I dare not come again. Tell the truth about it, Linton, for I mustn't come, if I've hurt you. You must come to cure me, he answered. You ought to come because you've hurt me. You know you have extremely. It was not all as ill when you entered, and as I am at present, was I? But you've made yourself ill by crying and being in a passion. I didn't do it all, said his cousin. However, we'll be friends now. And you want me? You would wish to see me sometimes, really? I told you I did, he replied impatiently. Sit on the settle and let me lean on your knee. That's as Mummy used to do, whole afternoons together. Sit quite still and don't talk, but you may sing a song if you can sing, or you may say a nice, long, interesting ballad, one of those you promised to teach me, or a story. I'd rather have a ballad, though. Begin. Catherine repeated the longest she could remember. The employment pleased both mightily. Linton would have another and another after another, notwithstanding my strenuous objections, and so they went on until the clock struck 12, and we heard Hareton in the court, returning for his dinner. And tomorrow, Catherine, you will be here tomorrow? Asked young Heathcliff, holding her frock, as she rose reluctantly. No, I answered, nor next day neither. She, however, gave a different response, evidently, for his forehead cleared as she stooped and whispered in his ear. You won't go tomorrow, recollect, miss. I commenced. But we were out of the house. You are not dreaming of it, are you? She smiled. Oh, I'll take good care, I continued. I'll have that lock mended, and you can escape by no way else. I can get over the wall, she said, laughing. The Grange is not a prison. Ellen, and you are not my jailer. And besides, I'm almost 17. I'm a woman, and I'm certain Linton would recover quickly if he had me to look after him. I'm older than he is, and wiser, less childish, am I not? And he'll soon do as I direct him with some slight coaxing. He's a pretty little darling when he's good. I'll make such a pet of him. If he were mine, we should never quarrel, should we? After we were used to each other, don't you like him, Ellen? Like him, I exclaimed. The worst-tempered bit of sickly slip that ever struggled into its teens. Happily, as Mr. Heathcliff conjectured, he'll not win 20. I doubt whether he'll see spring indeed, and small loss to his family whenever he drops off, and lucky it is for us that his father took him. The kinder he was treated, the more tedious and selfish he'd be. I'm glad you have no chance of having him for a husband, Miss Catherine. My companion waxed serious at hearing this speech. To speak of his death so regardlessly wounded her feelings. He's younger than I, she answered, after a protracted pause of meditation. And he ought to live the longest. He will. He must live as long as I do. He's as strong now as when he first came into the north. I'm positive of that. It's only a cold that ails him, the same as Papa has. You say Papa will get better, and why shouldn't he? Well, well, I cried. After all, we needn't trouble ourselves for listen, miss. And mind, I'll keep my word, if you attempt going to Wuthering Heights again, with or without me, I shall inform Mr. Linton, and unless he allow it, the intimacy with your cousin must not be revived. It has been revived, muttered Cathy sulkily. Must not be continued then, I said. We'll see, was her reply, and she set off at a gallop, leaving me to toil in the rear. We both reached home before our dinner time. My master supposed we'd been wandering through the park, and therefore he demanded no explanation of our absence. As soon as I entered, I hastened to change my soaked shoes and stockings, but sitting such a while at the Heights had done the mischief. On the succeeding morning I was laid up, and during 3 weeks I remained incapacitated for attending to my duties. A calamity never experienced prior to that period, and never, I am thankful to say, since. My little mistress behaved like an angel in coming to wait on me and cheer my solitude. The confinement brought me exceedingly low. It was wearisome to a stirring, active body, but few have slighter reasons for complaints than I had. The moment Catherine left Mr. Linton's room, she appeared at my bedside. Her day was divided between us. No amusement usurped a minute. She neglected her meals, her studies, and her play, and she was the fondest nurse that ever watched. She must have had a warm heart when she loved her father so, to give so much to me. I said her days were divided between us, but the master retired early, and I generally needed nothing after 6 o'clock. Thus the evening was her own. Poor thing, I never considered what she did with herself after tea, and though frequently, when she looked in to bid me good night, I remarked a fresh colour in her cheeks and a pinkness over her slender fingers, instead of fancying the hue borrowed from a cold ride across the moors. I laid it to the charge of a hot fire in the library. And now we'll read chapter 10, if you want to stick around. It's nice and hot. Chapter 10. At the close of 3 weeks, I was able to quit my chamber and move about the house. And on the first occasion of my sitting up in the evening, I asked Catherine to read to me because my eyes were weak. We were in the library. The master having gone to bed, she consented rather unwillingly, I fancied, and imagining my sort of books did not suit her, I bid her please herself in the choice of what she perused. She selected one of her own favourites and got forward steadily about an hour. Then came frequent questions. Ellen, are you not tired? Hadn't you better lay down now? You'll be sick. keeping up so long, Ellen. No, no, dear, I'm not tired, I returned continually. Perceiving me immovable, she essayed another method of showing her disrelish for her occupation. It changed to yawning and stretching and, Ellen, I'm tired. Give over then and talk, I answered. That was worse. She fretted and sighed and looked at her watch till 8 and finally went to her room completely overdone with sleep, judging by her peevishness, heavy look, and the constant rubbing she inflicted on her eyes. The following night she seemed more impatient still, and on the 3rd, from recovering my company, she complained of a headache and left me. I thought her conduct odd, and having remained alone a long while, I resolved on going and inquiring whether she were better, and asking her to come and lie on the sofa instead of upstairs in the dark. No Catherine could I discover upstairs, and none below. The servants affirmed they had not seen her. I listened at Mr. Edgar's door. All was silence. I returned to her apartment, extinguished my candle, and seated myself in the window. The moon shone bright, a sprinkling of snow covered the ground, and I reflected that she might possibly have taken it into her head to walk about the garden for refreshment. I did detect a figure creeping along the inner fence of the park, but it was not my young mistress. On its emerging into the light, I recognized one of the grooms. He stood a considerable period viewing the carriage road through the grounds, then started off at a brisk pace, as if he had detected something, and reappeared presently, leading Mrs. Pony, and there she was, just dismounted and walking by its side. The man took his charge stealthily across the grass towards the stable. Cathy entered by the casement window of the drawing-room and glided noiselessly up to where I awaited her. She put the door gently to, slipped off her snowy shoes, untied her hat, and was proceeding, unconscious of my espionage. She lay aside her mantle when I suddenly rose and revealed myself. The surprise petrified her in an instant. She uttered an inarticulate exclamation and stood fixed. "My dear Miss Catherine," I began, too vividly impressed by her recent kindness to break into a cold, "where have you been riding out at this hour? And why should you try to deceive me by telling a tale? Where have you been? Speak." "To the bottom of the park," she stammered. "I didn't tell a tale." "And no, where else?" I demanded. "No," was the muttered reply. "Oh, Catherine," I cried sorrowfully, "you know you have been doing wrong, and you wouldn't be driven to uttering an untruth to me. That does grieve me. I'd rather be 3 months ill than hear you frame a deliberate lie." She sprang forward and, bursting into tears, threw her arms around my neck. "Well, Ellen, I'm so afraid of you being angry," she said. "Promise not to be angry, and you shall know the very truth. I hate to hide it." We sat down in the window seat. I assured her I would not scold, whatever her secret might be, and I guessed it, of course. So she commenced. "I've been to Wuthering Heights, Ellen, and I've never missed going a day since you fell ill, except thrice before, and twice after you left your room. I gave Michael books and pictures to prepare Minnie every evening, and to put her back in the stable. You mustn't scold him either, mind. I was at the Heights by 6:30, and generally stayed till 8:30, and then galloped home. It was not to amuse myself that I went. I was often wretched all the time. Now and then I was happy, once in a week perhaps. At first I expected there would be sad work persuading you to let me keep my word to Linton, for I had engaged to call again next day, when we quitted him. But as you stayed upstairs on the morrow, I escaped that trouble, and while Michael was refastening the lock on the park door in the afternoon, I got possession of the key, and told him how my cousin wished me to visit him, because he was sick, and couldn't come to the Grange, and how Papa would object to my going. And then I negotiated with him about the pony. He's fond of reading, and he thinks of leaving soon to get married. So he offered if I would lend him books out of the library to do what I wished. But I preferred giving him my own, and that satisfied him better. On my second visit, Linton seemed in lively spirits, and Zillah, that is their housekeeper, made us a clean room and a good fire, and told us, as Joseph was out at prayer meeting, and Hareton Earnshaw was off his dogs, robbing our woods of pheasants, as I heard afterwards, we might do what we liked. She brought me some warm wine and gingerbread, and appeared exceedingly good-natured, and Linton sat in the armchair, and I in the little rocking chair on the hearthstone, and we laughed and talked so merrily, and found so much to say. We planned where we would go, and what we would do in summer. I needn't repeat that, because you would call it silly. One time, however, we were near quarrelling. He said the pleasant manner of spending a hot July day was lying from morning till evening on a bank of heath in the middle of the moors, with the bees humming dreamily about among the bloom, and the larks singing high up overhead, and the blue sky and bright sun shining steadily and cloudlessly. That was his most perfect idea of heaven's happiness. Mine was rocking in a rustling green tree, with a west wind blowing and bright, white clouds flitting rapidly above, and not only larks but throttles and blackbirds and linnets and cuckoos pouring out music on every side, and the moors seen at a distance broken into cool dusky dells, but close by great swells of long grass undulating in waves to the breeze, and woods and sounding water, and the whole world awake and wild with joy. He wanted all to lie in an ecstasy of peace. I wanted all to sparkle and dance in a glorious jubilee. I said his heaven would be only half alive, and he said mine would be drunk. I said I should fall asleep in his, and he said he could not breathe in mine, and began to grow very snappish. At last we agreed to try both as soon as the right weather came, and then we kissed each other and were friends. After sitting still an hour, I looked at the great room with its smooth, uncarpeted floor, and thought how nice it would be to play in if we removed the table, and I asked Linton to call Zillah in to help us. We'd have a game of blind man's buff. She should try to catch us. You used to, you know, Ellen. He wouldn't. There was no pleasure in it, he said, but he consented to play at ball with me. We found two in a cupboard among a heap of old toys, tops and hoops, and battledores and shuttlecocks. One was marked C and the other H. I wished to have the C because that stood for Catherine, and the H might be for Heathcliff, his name, but the brand came out of H, and Linton didn't like it. I beat him constantly, and he got cross and coughed and returned to his chair. That night, though, he easily recovered his good humour. He was charmed with 2 or 3 pretty songs, your songs, Ellen, and when I was obliged to go, he begged and entreated me to come the following evening, and I promised. Minnie and I went flying home as light as air, and I dreamt of Wuthering Heights and my sweet darling cousin till morning. On the morrow I was sad, partly because you were poorly, and partly that I wished my father knew, approved of my excursions, but it was beautiful moonlight after tea, and as I rode on, the gloom cleared. I shall have another happy evening, I thought to myself, and what delights me more, my pretty Linton will. I trotted up their garden and was turning round to the back, when the fellow Earnshaw met me, took my bridle and bid me go in by the front entrance. He patted Minnie's neck and said he was a bonny beast, and appeared as if he wanted me to speak to him. I only told him to leave my horse alone, or else it would kick him. He answered in his vulgar accent, "It wouldn't do Mitch hurt if it did," and surveyed its legs with a smile. I was half inclined to make it try. However, he moved off to open the door, and as he raised the latch, he looked up to the inscription above and said, with a stupid mixture of awkwardness and elation, "Miss Catherine, I can read yonna." "Wonderful," I exclaimed. "Pray let us hear you. You are grown clever." He spelt and drawled over by syllables the name, Hareton Earnshaw, and the figures. I cried encouragingly, perceiving that he came to a dead halt. "I cannot tell them yet," he answered. "Oh, you dunce," I said, laughing heartily at his failure. The fool stared, with a grin hovering about about his lips and a scowl gathering over his eyes, as if uncertain whether he might not join in my mirth. Whether it were not pleasant familiarity, or what it really was, contempt. I settled his doubts by suddenly retrieving my gravity and desiring him to walk away, for I came to see Linton, not him. He reddened. I saw that by the moonlight, dropped his hand from the latch, and skulked off, a picture of mortified vanity. He imagined himself to be as accomplished as Linton, I suppose, because he could spell his own name, and was marvellously discomfited that I didn't think the same. "Stop, Miss Catherine dear," I interrupted. "I shall not scold, but I don't like your conduct there. If you had remembered that Hareton was your cousin as much as master, Heathcliff, you would have felt how improper it was to behave in that way. At least it was praiseworthy ambition for him to desire to be as accomplished as Linton, and probably he did not learn merely to show off. You had made him ashamed of his ignorance. Before, I have no doubt, and he wished to remedy it and please you. To sneer at his imperfect attempt was very bad breeding. Had you been brought up in his circumstances, would you be less rude? He was as quick as and intelligent as child as you ever were, and I'm hurt that you should be despised now, because that base Heathcliff has treated him so unjustly." "Well, Ellen, you won't cry about it, will you?" she exclaimed, surprised at my earnestness. "But wait, and you shall hear if he conned his ABC to please me, and if it were worth while being civil to the brute." I entered. Linton was lying on the settle and half got up to welcome me. "I'm ill tonight, Catherine, love," he said, "and you must have all the talk and let me listen. Come and sit by me. I was sure you wouldn't break your word, and I'll make you promise again before you go." I knew now that I mustn't tease him, as he was ill, and I spoke softly and put no questions, and avoided irritating him in any way. I'd brought some of my nicest books for him. He asked me to read a little of one, and I was about to comply, when Earnshaw burst the door open, having gathered venom with reflection. He advanced direct towards us, seized Linton by the arm, and swung him off the seat. "Get to thy own room," he said in a voice almost inarticulate with passion, and his face looked swelled and furious. "Take her there if she comes to see thee. Thou shan't keep me out of this. Begone with you both." He swore at us and left Linton no time to answer, nearly throwing him in the kitchen, and he clenched his fist as I followed, seemingly longing to knock me down. I was afraid for a moment, and I let one volume fall. He kicked it after me and shut us out. I heard a malignant, crackly laugh by the fire, and turning beheld that odious Joseph standing, rubbing his bony hands and quivering. "Oh, assure yourself you out. He's a grand lad. He's getting to right spirit in him. He knows, he knows, and well as we do, we should be the master yonder. You mad, you skiffed probably. Where must we go?" I said to my cousin, disregarding the old wretch's mockery. Linton was white and trembling. He was not pretty then, Ellen. Oh no, he looked frightful, for his thin face and large eyes were wrought into an expression of frantic, powerless fury. He grasped the handle of the door and shook it. It was fastened inside. "If you don't let me in, I'll kill you. If you don't let me in, I'll kill you," he rather shrieked than said. "Devil, devil, I'll kill you, I'll kill you." Joseph uttered his croaking laugh again. "There, that's the father," he cried. "That's father. Will us summat the other side of us never heed Hareton, lad. Dunna to be feared. He cannot get at thee." I took hold of Linton's hands and tried to pull him away, but he shrieked so shockingly that I dared not proceed. At last his cries were choked by a dreadful fit of coughing. Blood gushed from his mouth, and he fell on the ground. I ran into the yard, sick with terror, and called for Zillah as loud as I could. She soon heard me. She was milking the cows in a shed behind the barn and hurrying from her work. She inquired what there was to do. I hadn't the breath to explain. Dragging her in, I looked about for Linton. Earnshaw had come out to examine the mischief he had caused, and he was then conveying the poor thing upstairs. Zillah and I ascended after him, but he stopped me at the top of the steps and said, I shouldn't go in, I must go home. I exclaimed that he had killed Linton and I would enter. Joseph locked the door and declared I should do no such stuff, and asked me whether I were bound to be as mad as him. I stood crying till the housekeeper reappeared. She affirmed he would be better in a bit, but he couldn't do with the shrieking and din, and she took me and nearly carried me into the house. Ellen, I was ready to tear my hair off my head. I sobbed and wept so much that my eyes were almost blind, and the ruffian you have such sympathy with stood opposite, presuming every now and then to bid me wished, and denying that it was my fault, that it was his fault, and finally, frightened by my assertions that I would tell Papa, and that he should be put in prison and hanged, he commenced blubbering himself and hurried out to hide his cowardly agitation. Still, I was not rid of him. When at length they compelled me to depart, and I had got some 100 yards off the premises, he suddenly issued from the shadow of the roadside and checked Minnie and took hold of me. Miss Catherine, I'm ill-grieved, he began, but it's rather too bad. I gave him a cut with my whip, thinking perhaps he would murder me. He let go, thundering one of his horrid curses, and I galloped home more than half out of my senses. I didn't bid you good night that evening, and I didn't go to Wuthering Heights the next. I wished to, exceedingly, but I was strangely excited and dreaded to hear that Linton was dead, sometimes shuddered at the thought of encountering Hareton. On the third day I took courage at least. I couldn't bear longer suspense and stole off once more. I went at 5 o'clock and walked, fancying I might manage to creep into the house and up to Linton's room unobserved. However, the dogs gave notice of my approach. Zillah received me and, saying the lad was mending nicely, showed me into a small, tidy, carpeted apartment where, to my inexpressible joy, I beheld Linton laid on a little sofa reading one of my books. But he wouldn't neither speak to me nor look at me. Through a whole hour, Ellen, he was such an unhappy temper, and what quite confounded me was that he did open his mouth it was to utter the falsehood that I had occasioned the uproar, and Hareton was not to blame. Unable to reply, except passionately, got up and walked from the room. He sent after me a faint Catherine. He did not reckon on being answered so, but I wouldn't turn back, and the morrow was the second day on which I stayed at home, nearly determined to visit him no more. But it was so miserable going to bed and getting up and never hearing anything about him, that my resolution melted into air before it was properly formed. It had appeared wrong to take the journey once. Now it seemed wrong to refrain. Michael came to ask if he must saddle Minnie. I said yes, and considered myself doing a duty as she bore me over the hills. I was forced to pass the front windows to get to the court. It was no use trying to conceal my presence. Young master is in the house, said Zillah, and she saw me making for the parlour. I went in. Earnshaw was there also, but he quitted the room directly. Linton sat in the great armchair half asleep, walking up to the fire. I began in a serious tone, partly meaning it to be true. As you don't like me, Linton, as you think I come on purpose to hurt you, and pretend that I do so every time. This is our last meeting. Let us say goodbye and tell Mr. Heathcliff that you have no wish to see me, and that he mustn't invent any more falsehoods on the subject. Sit down and take your hat off, Catherine, he answered. You are so much happier than I am. You ought to be better. Papa talks enough of my defects and shows enough scorn of me to make it natural I should doubt myself. I doubt whether I am not altogether as worthless as he calls me. Frequently, and then I feel so cross and bitter I hate everybody. I am worthless and bad in temper and bad in spirit, almost always. If you choose, you may say goodbye. You'll get rid of an annoyance. Only, Catherine, do me this justice. Believe that if I might be as sweet and as kind and as good as you are, I will be as willingly and more so than happy and healthy, and believe that your kindness has made me love you deeper than if I deserved your love. And though I couldn't and cannot help showing my nature to you, I regret it and repent it, and shall regret and repent it till I die. I felt he spoke the truth, and I felt I must forgive him, and though he should quarrel the next moment, I must forgive him again. We were reconciled, but we cried, both of us, the whole time I stayed. Not entirely for sorrows, yet I was sorry that Linton had that distorted nature. He'll never let his friends be at ease, and he'll never be at ease himself. I've always gone to this little parlour since that night, because his father returned the day after. About 3 times, I think, we have been merry and hopeful, and we were the first evening. The rest of my visits were dreary and troubled, now with his selfishness and spite, and now with his sufferings, but I've learnt to endure the former with nearly as little resentment as the latter. Mr. Heathcliff purposely avoids me. I've hardly seen him at all. Last Sunday, indeed, coming earlier than usual, I heard him abusing poor Linton cruelly for his conduct of the night before. I can't tell you how I knew of it, unless he listened. Linton had certainly behaved provokingly, however. It was the business of nobody but me, and I interrupted Mr. Heathcliff's lecture by entering and telling him so. He burst into a laugh and went away, saying he was glad I took the view of the matter. Since then, I've told Linton he must whisper his bitter things. Now, Ellen, you have heard all, and I can't be prevented from going to Wuthering Heights except by inflicting misery on 2 people, whereas if you'll only not tell Papa, my going need disturb the tranquillity of none. You'll not tell, will you? It will be very heartless if you do. I'll make up my mind on that point by tomorrow, Miss Catherine, I replied. It requires some study, and so I'll leave you to your rest and go think it over. I thought it over aloud in my master's presence, walking straight from her room to his and relating the whole story, with the exception of her conversations with her cousin and any mention of Hareton. Mr. Linton was alarmed and distressed more than he could acknowledge to me. In the morning, Catherine learnt my betrayal of her confidence, and she learnt also that her secret visits were to end. In vain she wept and writhed against the interdict and implored her father to have pity on Linton. All she got to comfort her was a promise that he would write and give him leave to come to the Grange when he pleased, but explaining that he must no longer expect to see Catherine at Wuthering Heights. Perhaps he'd been aware of his nephew's disposition and state of health. He would have seen fit to withhold even the slight consolation. And that was the end of chapter 10. Next time we'll read chapter 11. But that's enough for today's reading. Hope you enjoyed, and I hope you had a nice cup of tea along with me. Okay, besties, bye for now.